8,000 clay soldiers, buried underground for over 2,000 years, and nobody thought to ask, who paid for all this? Not just the statues, the horses, the chariots, the weapons, real ones by the way, not decorative, the workshops, the kilns, the roads built just to move materials, the armies of supervisors watching the armies of workers building an army that would never fight anyone. All of it for one man who was already dead. When you put it that way, it stops looking like ancient grandeur and starts looking like a receipt, a very, very expensive receipt. And what that receipt tells you about power, money, and the oldest tricks in the book, that's what nobody talks about. So let's talk about it. But first, you need to understand what China looked like before any of this was possible. Forget the unified empire for a second. Wind the clock back further. What you've got is a collection of rival states, each one clawing at the others for land, grain, soldiers, survival. This wasn't polite political competition. This was centuries of grinding, exhausting warfare where the losers didn't get a consolation prize. They got absorbed. And in that brutal environment, one state figured something out that the others hadn't quite cracked yet. Qin.
Now, Qin didn't win because people loved them. Nobody loved Qin. Qin won because they got very, very good at something that sounds boring but is actually one of the most dangerous capabilities a government can develop. Counting. Counting households, counting harvests, counting men of military age, counting obligations. While other states were still operating on old feudal handshakes where local aristocrats held real power and the center just kind of hoped for the best, Qin was building something colder, harder, more systematic. They reorganized land, they registered families, they tied loyalty directly to the state, not to local noble families who might have other ideas. Here's the hidden rule of power that nobody puts on the tourism brochure. The moment a government gets better at measuring its population, the population discovers it's been drafted into a much larger project, one it didn't volunteer for. Qin figured that out early, and they never forgot it. So by the time the king of Qin finished swallowing the last rival state and declared himself the first emperor, he wasn't building this machine from scratch. He was inheriting generations of bureaucratic muscle memory. The conquest was the headline. What came after, the extraction, that was the business model. And here's where the financial story actually begins. Because ruling a giant empire isn't like winning a war. Winning is a moment. Ruling is every single day, forever, requiring grain, soldiers, roads, administrators, loyalty, and a tax base that doesn't collapse the minute people realize how much is being taken from them. In the ancient world, financing the state didn't mean what it means now. It wasn't interest rates and bond yields. It was grain pulled from storage. It was men pulled from farms. It was weeks of your life legally owed to the government, spent building something you'd never benefit from. Taxation wasn't abstract. It showed up at your door, literally. That's the context. Now look at the Terracotta Army again. This wasn't a wealthy society casually spending its surplus on art. This was a centralized state that had learned, really learned, how to take millions of tiny individual obligations and redirect them toward one colossal project chosen entirely by the center. Ancient accounts describe hundreds of thousands of workers involved in the mausoleum complex over many years. Whether the exact figures are perfect isn't even the point. The scale is the point. Because a local king, even a rich one, cannot feed, supervise, and coordinate a workforce that size. You need something bigger. You need a state with extraordinary reach, extraordinary records, and an extraordinary willingness to compel participation from people who weren't asked whether they'd like to participate. That's what built the Terracotta Army. Not abundance, not enthusiasm. Organized compulsion, wrapped in administrative genius. Quite the combination. So where did the resources actually come from? Start with the land. Farmers were the foundation of everything, and farmers carried most of the weight. Tax in Qin wasn't a percentage of income you calculated once a year with a form in a bad mood. It was grain taken from your actual storehouse. It was labor days demanded at whatever moment the state decided it needed them, which historically tended to be the worst possible moment for you personally. It was military service that took your sons. It was transport duties that took your animals. A peasant family didn't experience the glory of the First Empire as a chapter in a history book. They experienced it as an empty granary and a missing son. But here's the part where the story gets genuinely interesting and genuinely instructive. Because the emperor didn't just take more, he made taking easier. And he did it through something that sounds almost comically dull. Standardization? Standardization. Not exactly the stuff of legend, right? Except it kind of is. The First Empire imposed uniform weights and measures across the entire realm, common coinage, a standardized script so that orders from the center could be read clearly at the edges, roads built to consistent specifications. Think about what that actually means in practice. Before unification, every former state had its own way of measuring grain, its own currency, its own writing conventions. You want to tax a region that uses different measurements? Good luck. You want to move supplies across roads that weren't designed to connect? Enjoy that. You want to issue commands in a script the local administrator can't quite read? Fewer local differences meant fewer places for power to get lost in translation. And power that stops getting lost tends to arrive more efficiently. At your door. Demanding things. This is the part that should make you sit up slightly, because standardization is almost always sold as a benefit. Common measures, easier trade, simpler exchange. And those things are real. But for the people running the system, standardization is also something else entirely. Visibility. Whatever a state can see clearly, it can tax more effectively. Every time a government makes values, obligations, and outputs easier to compare and measure, the center gains leverage. The Qin emperor was essentially building the ancient world's most sophisticated data infrastructure, not for the benefit of farmers, for the benefit of the machine that needed to use farmers efficiently. Genius, honestly. Deeply uncomfortable genius, but genius. Now, here's the part that makes the Terracotta Army genuinely unsettling once you understand it. The mausoleum wasn't financed by prosperity. It was financed by compulsion. The Qin state was famously harsh. Punishments were severe, law was strict, and crucially, labor could be commanded. Corvée obligations meant the government could legally demand your time and body for public works. Convicts could be driven into state projects. Entire populations could be mobilized for walls, roads, palaces, or the underground empire of a dead ruler. This meant the state didn't need to pay market wages. It could lower costs, not through innovation, but through the simple, brutal mechanism of making refusal illegal. That's a cost structure that's hard to compete with. And this is a pattern that shows up again and again across economic history. What looks impressively efficient from above, vast projects completed at astonishing speed and scale, often depends entirely on someone at the bottom being denied the right to say no. The efficiency wasn't in better tools, it was in eliminated choices. But here's where the story gets genuinely sophisticated. Because the Terracotta Army wasn't just massive, it was organized in a way that reveals how far the empire had pushed its production logic. These weren't identical figures stamped out mindlessly. The project combined standardized production with remarkable variation. Bodies made in modular sections, assembled efficiently, then individualized with different faces, ranks, expressions. Weapons produced at scale with striking consistency. Inspectors' marks stamped right into the bronze, tracking who made what. Clay workers, bronze casters, timber suppliers, transport teams, kiln operators, finishing artisans, all of it coordinated, all of it moving toward the same underground destination.
This was, in the most real sense, a state-managed production system operating at industrial logic. Not industrial in the coal and steam sense, industrial in its structure, centralized coordination, mass production, specialization, quality control, accountability chains. The tomb was a monument. It was also a factory ecosystem. And that is why it matters financially. The same state that conquered rival kingdoms had learned how to organize human effort at a scale nobody in East Asia had seen before. That's not just impressive archaeology. That's a template, a blueprint for what concentrated administrative power, pushed far enough, actually looks like an operation. And templates have a way of outlasting the people who created them. But now, and this is where every story about concentrated power eventually arrives, the bill came due. Because here's the thing about systems built on extraction rather than consent. They can be extraordinarily powerful in the short run, terrifyingly powerful, build an underground army powerful, and they can look completely invincible right up until the moment they aren't. The First Empire asked an enormous amount from the people beneath it. Farmers taxed, workers mobilized, households monitored, sons conscripted, communities strained by the relentless weight of imperial ambition. From the palace, standardization looked like order. From the countryside, it looked like intrusion wearing the costume of order. And there's a difference, a crucial difference, between people who feel governed and people who feel harvested. Governed people tolerate a lot. Harvested people eventually stop tolerating. A state can get extremely good at extraction without getting any better at durability. In fact, the more efficiently you extract, the faster you can outrun the legitimacy that keeps the whole thing from falling apart. The Qin dynasty collapsed with startling speed after the first emperor died. Rebellion spread. The imperial order fractured. The house that had built roads, codified law, unified weights and measures, and deposited 8,000 soldiers underground for eternity, gone within a short span. The most impressive state-building project in Chinese history up to that point, and it couldn't survive its own founder by long. That's not a footnote, that's the verdict. The empire had enough power to build an afterlife, not enough resilience to secure its own future. Over-concentration will do that. Systems that are terrifyingly strong while the center holds become dangerously brittle the moment the center shakes, every single time. Here's the uncomfortable part, the part where this stops being ancient history and starts being something else. Modern states don't conscript farmers into tomb construction. The methods are considerably more sophisticated now. They tax, they borrow, they inflate, they regulate, they standardize. Oh, they still standardize. They direct credit, subsidize priorities, and present all of it as technical necessity rather than political choice. But the underlying pattern? The one where dispersed individual obligations get quietly converted into concentrated outcomes chosen by the center? That pattern is not ancient. That pattern is Tuesday. The specific mechanisms of the Qin machine, compulsory labor, grain seizure, direct conscription, those look extreme from the outside. But the logic of the machine? Make society legible, make obligations measurable, reduce friction, increase extraction, direct the surplus toward priorities set at the top. Dress the whole thing in the language of order, necessity, and national greatness? Does any of that sound unfamiliar? Take your time. There's one more thing worth sitting with before we close this out, and it's the most important one. We're trained to admire scale, a colossal monument, a giant corporation, a sovereign wealth fund, a military superpower. Scale feels like proof of something, intelligence, order, historical destiny. When something is big enough, we assume it must have been worth it. But scale is also proof of something else, that a society became very easy for its center to use. The Terracotta Army is extraordinary. 8,000 individual figures, each one distinct, buried in perfect formation, preserved across millennia. Genuinely extraordinary. It's also, when you look at it honestly, a record of immense asymmetry. One ruler's vision of eternity became a continental-scale burden distributed across countless households that were never asked. The empire didn't consult the farmers whose grain funded the kilns. It didn't negotiate with the workers whose years went into the clay. It simply had the administrative reach to make them contribute, and a legal system ready to handle anyone who disagreed. That's the through line. Administration became extraction. Extraction became spectacle. Spectacle became legacy. And somewhere underneath all that legacy were people who just wanted to keep their grain and bring their sons home. The dynasty looked immortal in clay. It turned out to be remarkably mortal in practice. Here at Money Never Learns, that's basically our entire thesis in one sentence. So the next time you're looking at something vast and impressive, a monument, a company, an institution, a policy, don't just ask how powerful it is. Ask who's paying for it. Ask whether the people at the bottom could say no. Ask whether the system is durable or just temporarily, magnificently, terrifyingly strong. Because the most impressive things a system ever builds are sometimes the clearest warning signs that it's about to crack. The clay soldiers are still standing. The empire that made them didn't last. History doesn't repeat, but it does send very large, very obvious warnings. Most people walk past them and take photos. If you're the type who actually wants to understand what you're looking at, you know where the subscribe button is.